In Millfield, Ohio, a 72-year-old retired high school principal was about to discover just how little his family valued him. What began as a routine hip replacement surgery escalated into a shocking revelation when not a single family member arrived to take him home. For Richard Thornton, the empty hospital waiting room would become the first step toward reclaiming his dignity and his future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Richard wasn't your typical doting father and grandfather. For 4 decades, he had been a disciplined administrator known for his fairness, integrity, and ability to see through excuses. When he found himself sitting alone in a hospital wheelchair with discharge papers in hand, he realized his children's constant excuses about being too busy masked a darker truth that would soon come to light. Richard's decision to take a cab directly to his lawyer's office would lead to the most dramatic family confrontation imaginable, exposing years of financial exploitation and betrayal. Before we continue with Richard's story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've got something special that will change how you think about family loyalty forever. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, highlighting the clock that now showed 3:45 p.m. Richard Thornton had been sitting in the discharge area for nearly 4 hours, his packed overnight bag resting beside the wheelchair. Hospital policy required him to use until he left the building. His hip surgery had gone well, and his recovery had been faster than expected for a man of 72, but the nurse's sympathetic glances were becoming harder to bear with each passing hour. "Mr. Thornton, I've tried calling your daughter again, nurse," Melissa said, her voice gentle but concerned. "It's going straight to voicemail. Is there someone else we could contact for you?" Richard's weathered hands tightened slightly on the arms of the wheelchair. After 40 years as a high school principal, he developed the ability to maintain composure in almost any situation, but the humiliation of being forgotten by his own children was testing his limits. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," he replied, his deep voice steady despite the ache that had nothing to do with his recent surgery. "I'll arrange for a taxi." Melissa hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with releasing a 72-year-old post-surgical patient to a taxi. "Are you sure? We could arrange for a hospital social worker to help coordinate your return home." "I'm perfectly capable of managing a taxi ride," Richard said with the quiet authority that had once silenced rowdy school assemblies. "And I need to make a stop before going home anyway." The truth was, Richard had suspected something like this might happen. His relationship with his 3 adult children had been deteriorating for years, a slow erosion of respect and consideration that he'd tried to attribute to their busy lives and the geographic distance between them. But sitting alone in that hospital wheelchair, he was forced to confront the possibility that the problem ran much deeper. His eldest, Catherine, lived just 20 minutes from the hospital with her husband in the sprawling Tudor home Richard had helped them purchase with a generous down payment 10 years ago. Martin, his middle child, had moved to Cincinnati for work but had promised to drive up for the surgery. And Rebecca, his youngest, lived right in Millfield, in the historic family home that Richard had signed over to her after his wife Margaret passed away 5 years earlier. All 3 had offered seemingly reasonable excuses when he'd mentioned his upcoming surgery during their monthly family video call. Catherine's son had a soccer tournament that weekend. Martin was in the middle of a big project at work. Rebecca was dealing with some unspecified house issues that required her attention. Richard had nodded understanding, assuring them he'd be fine on his own, even as a small voice inside questioned why none of them had offered to rearrange their schedules for something as significant as their father's surgery. Now, sitting in the hospital's sterile discharge area, that small voice had grown louder, impossible to ignore. Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through recent text messages. The pattern was clear and troubling. His children contacted him primarily when they needed something: advice about a home repair, questions about investments, requests for funds to cover unexpected expenses. The last time any of them had called just to check on him had been. Richard couldn't actually remember. "Mr. Thornton, your taxi has arrived," Melissa announced, returning to the discharge area. "Are you sure you don't want me to call your daughter one more time?" "No need," Richard said, tucking his phone away. "I think I finally understand the situation clearly." As the nurse helped him into the taxi, Richard gave the driver an address that wasn't his home. "Harrington, Morris, and Klein, please. It's a law office on Main Street." The driver nodded, pulling away from the hospital entrance. Richard watched the building recede in the rear window, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. For 5 years since Margaret's death, he'd been making excuses for his children's increasingly self-centered behavior. He told himself they were busy with their own families, their own careers, their own struggles. He'd convinced himself that their occasional visits and perfunctory phone calls were simply the natural evolution of family relationships as children grew older and parents aged. But being left stranded at the hospital crossed a line he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just inconsiderate, it was revealing of something far more troubling. Richard thought about the succession of financial emergencies his children had approached him with over the past 5 years. Catherine's kitchen renovation that had somehow ballooned to 3 times the original budget. Martin's investment opportunity that needed immediate cash. Rebecca's constant house repairs on the family home he'd signed over to her, with the understanding that he would always have his own space there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The family home. Richard's jaw tightened as he thought about the beautiful colonial on Elm Street where he and Margaret had raised their family. After her death, he'd agreed to transfer ownership to Rebecca, who had convinced him she would maintain it for future generations. He'd been living in the renovated garden apartment they'd originally built for Margaret's mother, with its separate entrance and small kitchen. The arrangement had seemed perfect: independence for him, security for Rebecca, and preservation of the family heritage. But over the past year, his access to the main house had been increasingly restricted. Family dinners had become rare. His suggestions about maintenance were ignored. And just last month, he discovered a small stack of mail that had been delivered to the main house but never passed on to him, including an invitation to his oldest friend's retirement party, which he'd missed as a result. The taxi pulled up in front of an imposing brick building in downtown Millfield. Harrington, Morris, and Klein had been Richard's legal advisors for decades. Janet Klein had handled Margaret's estate and all the subsequent property transfers to their children. If anyone could help him understand his current legal position, and what options he might have to correct his past generosity, it would be her. "Would you like me to wait, sir?" the driver asked as Richard carefully maneuvered himself out of the car, leaning heavily on the cane the hospital had provided. "No, thank you," Richard replied, paying the fare with a generous tip. "I suspect this may take some time." The receptionist looked up in surprise as Richard entered the office. "Mr. Thornton. We weren't expecting you today." "And, weren't you just in surgery this week?" "Yesterday, to be precise," Richard said, easing himself into one of the comfortable visitor chairs. "I find myself in need of Janet's counsel on an urgent matter. Is she available?" The young woman's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Let me check for you right away." While waiting, Richard noticed a family seated across the reception area, parents probably in their 40s, with 2 teenagers who were actually engaging in conversation rather than staring at their phones. The father said something that made them all laugh, a moment of easy familial connection that sent a pang through Richard's chest. Had his family ever been that close? He thought they had been, once, when the children were younger and Margaret was alive. Where had things gone so wrong? "Richard." Janet Klein's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stood in the doorway to the inner offices, her expression a mixture of concern and surprise. "What on earth are you doing here today? You should be at home recovering." Janet had been a close friend of Margaret's since college, and her legal expertise had guided the Thornton family through numerous life events. In her mid-60s, she maintained the sharp mind and direct approach that had made her one of the most respected attorneys in the county. "I would be at home," Richard said, carefully rising to his feet, "if any of my children had bothered to pick me up from the hospital." Janet's expression shifted immediately from surprise to anger on his behalf. "Come into my office right now," she said, moving to help him navigate the hallway. "This we need to discuss immediately." Once settled in the privacy of her office, with its impressive bookshelves and views of the town square, Richard recounted the events of the day, along with the growing concerns he'd been trying to ignore over the past few years. "I've been a fool, Janet," he concluded, staring down at his hands. "I thought I was helping them, setting them up for success. Instead, I've apparently raised 3 adults who see me as nothing more than a financial resource." Janet had been taking notes throughout his explanation, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "Before we go further, I need to ask, have you checked your bank accounts recently? Your investment portfolio?" The question caught Richard off guard. "I review the monthly statements when they come in. Everything seemed in order last month." "And who has access to those accounts?" "Anyone with power of attorney or co-signing privileges?" Richard frowned. "After Margaret died, I added Catherine to my main checking account, just in case of emergency. And Martin helped me set up online banking, so I suppose he has my login information. Rebecca handles the property tax payments for the house since she lives there, so she has access to my tax reserves account." Janet's expression had grown increasingly grave. Richard, I think we need to do a full financial audit before we proceed with any other discussions. I'm concerned that your children's behavior might extend beyond simple neglect. The suggestion that his children might have been financially exploiting him seemed outlandish at first. These were successful, educated adults he had raised with strong values. Catherine was a pediatrician, for heaven's sake. Martin had an MBA and worked for a respected consulting firm. Rebecca was a high school counselor, following somewhat in his footsteps. But then he remembered the new luxury SUV Catherine had been driving when she'd last visited, despite her complaints about the cost of her son's private school. And Martin's sudden ability to purchase a vacation home in Florida last year, which he'd attributed to smart investments. And Rebecca's extensive renovations to the main house, far exceeding what her counselor's salary should allow. What would this audit involve? Richard asked, his principal's instinct for investigating troubling situations kicking in. We'll need to examine all your accounts, investment holdings, property records, and tax filings for the past 5 years, since Margaret's passing, Janet explained. I can have our financial forensics team start immediately. 5 years. The timeline hit Richard like a physical blow. Had his children been taking advantage of him for the entire period since their mother's death? Had his grief blinded him to their manipulation? Do it, he said firmly. And there's something else I need to discuss with you. The family home. Janet's expression softened slightly. I remember advising against transferring full ownership to Rebecca, if you recall. I do now, Richard acknowledged. At the time, it seemed like the right thing to do. Rebecca argued that it would avoid probate issues later, and that she would maintain the family legacy. She seemed so sincere. What's happened with the house? Janet asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Increasingly, I'm being treated like a tenant rather than family. Last week, Rebecca mentioned that her friend Angela might be interested in renting the apartment in a few months. When I asked for clarification, she changed the subject. Richard's voice remained steady, but the pain behind his words was evident. I believe she intends to evict me from my own home. Janet set down her pen and leaned forward. Richard, I need to be completely honest with you. If the property is in Rebecca's name without any conditions or life estate provisions, legally she can do that. The question is whether there's documentation of the original understanding when the transfer was made. Richard thought back to the property transfer. He'd been in a fog of grief, signing whatever was put in front of him, trusting his children to honor their mother's memory and care for him as he aged. I don't think we put anything in writing about my right to live there. It was just understood. Understood but not documented, Janet murmured, making another note. That complicates things, but doesn't make them impossible. The intercom on Janet's desk buzzed. Miss Klein, I have Catherine Thornton on line 1. She says it's urgent regarding her father. Richard and Janet exchanged glances. It seems the hospital may have finally reached her, Janet observed. Put her through, Janet instructed, pressing the speaker button so Richard could hear. Janet, thank God you're there, Catherine's voice came through clearly, the practiced concern of a physician evident in her tone. The hospital called and said Dad left against medical advice in a taxi. I'm worried he might be confused from the anesthesia. Have you heard from him? Before Janet could respond, Richard spoke up. I'm right here, Catherine. And I did not leave against medical advice. I was properly discharged 4 hours after you were supposed to pick me up. There was a moment of startled silence on the line. Dad? What are you doing at Janet's office? You should be home resting. Why didn't you call me if the hospital was releasing you early? The casual rewriting of reality, the implication that the hospital had changed plans rather than that she had failed in her commitment, crystallized something for Richard. This pattern of subtle manipulation, of shifting blame and reframing situations, had become his children's standard approach. The hospital didn't release me early, Catherine. They released me exactly when they told all 3 of you they would. At noon. I waited until nearly 4 o'clock before taking a taxi, after the nurses tried repeatedly to reach you, Martin, and Rebecca. Dad, there must be some misunderstanding. I had it in my calendar for 4 p.m., and I'm on my way to the hospital now. These mix-ups happen all the time with discharge planning. Her voice had taken on the slightly patronizing tone one might use with a confused elderly patient. Richard felt a surge of the righteous indignation that had once made him a formidable school administrator. There was no mix-up, Catherine. I have the discharge paperwork right here, with the time clearly stated. The same time that was on the surgical schedule I gave all of you last month. Well, regardless, Catherine continued, glossing over his point, the important thing is to get you home and settled. I'll come pick you up from Janet's office right now. That won't be necessary, Richard replied. Janet and I have some important legal matters to discuss. Matters concerning the family. Finances and properties. Another pause, this one longer and heavier with tension. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost its professional warmth. What kind of legal matters? Is something wrong? That's what we're working to determine, Janet interjected smoothly. Richard has raised some concerns about his financial arrangements and living situation that require my professional attention. I don't understand, Catherine said, her tone now somewhere between defensive and concerned. What financial arrangements? Dad, if you're worried about money, you know you can always talk to us. There's no need to involve lawyers. The irony of her statement, the suggestion that he should trust the very people who might be exploiting him, was not lost on Richard. I think at this point, legal clarity is exactly what's needed. Janet will be conducting a full audit of my finances and property arrangements. An audit? Catherine's voice rose slightly. Dad, this is ridiculous. You're just out of surgery. You're probably tired and emotional. Let me take you home, and we can discuss any concerns you have after you've rested. It was the same dismissive approach she'd taken increasingly often in recent years, treating his concerns as the confused worries of an aging parent rather than the legitimate observations of a still sharp mind. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, Richard replied. Janet, please continue with the audit as we discussed. Catherine, I suggest you call your brother and sister. The three of you should prepare for a family meeting once we have the results. Dad, Catherine began, but Richard had heard enough. Goodbye, Catherine. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to talk further. Janet ended the call, giving Richard an appraising look. That was admirably direct. Are you sure you're up for this? It could get messy, especially if the audit reveals what I suspect it might. Richard adjusted his position to ease the pressure on his healing hip. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional pain of realizing how his children had been treating him. But along with that pain came a growing sense of resolve, a determination to reclaim his dignity and security. I spent 40 years dealing with teenagers who thought they could outsmart the system, he said, a hint of his old authority returning to his voice. I think I can handle 3 adults who've forgotten the values their mother and I taught them. Janet smiled, the expression both sympathetic and approving. In that case, we should get you settled somewhere comfortable while we begin the process. You certainly can't go back to Rebecca's house, not until we understand the full situation. My friend Thomas has been asking me to visit his lake house for years, Richard mused. Perhaps now is the perfect time to take him up on that offer. Somewhere quiet where I can recover from surgery and process what we discover. As Janet made arrangements for the financial audit and called Thomas to explain the situation, Richard found himself thinking about Margaret. She had always been the heart of their family, the emotional glue that kept everyone connected and accountable. Had her absence created this void where integrity used to be? Or had she simply been the buffer that prevented him from seeing who his children truly were? Either way, Richard knew that the path forward would require every ounce of the strength and fairness that had defined his professional life. If his children had indeed been exploiting him, there would need to be consequences, but also an opportunity for redemption. And if, by some chance, this was all a terrible misunderstanding, then they would need to rebuild trust that had been severely damaged by today's revelation. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade as Richard prepared to leave Janet's office, a folder of preliminary paperwork tucked into his overnight bag. The taxi that would take him to Thomas's lake house waited outside, another step in this unexpected journey that had begun with an empty hospital waiting room. I'll call you tomorrow with an update, Janet promised, walking him slowly to the door. And Richard, I'm proud of you. Many people in your position would be too embarrassed or afraid to confront something like this. Richard thought about the thousands of students he had guided over his career, the countless times he had advised them to stand up for themselves and face difficult truths with courage. How could he do any less in his own life? Margaret always said that true character is revealed in how we respond to life's unexpected challenges, he replied, gripping his cane firmly as he prepared to step out into the evening air. I think this certainly qualifies as unexpected. As the taxi pulled away from the law office, Richard watched the familiar streets of Millfield pass by. The town where he'd built his career, raised his family, and planned to live out his retirement years in the comfort of family connection. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, and yet everything had changed. His phone buzzed with incoming calls and messages. Catherine, then Martin, then Rebecca, each one probably scrambling to understand what was happening, to develop a strategy, to protect whatever they might have taken from him. Richard silenced the device and tucked it away. They had ignored his calls for help today, he could certainly ignore theirs now. Tomorrow would begin the detailed work of uncovering the full extent of his children's actions. Financial records would be examined, property transfers scrutinized, and the careful accounting of familial betrayal tallied in black and white. It would be painful, perhaps the most painful experience of his life since losing Margaret. But as the taxi left the town limits and headed toward the peaceful lakeside retreat where he would recover both physically and emotionally, Richard felt something unexpected alongside the hurt and disappointment. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to reclaim not just his financial security but his very identity. For too long, he had allowed his role as father to override his rights as an individual. He had given and given, mistaking his children's taking for the natural order of family life. No more. Whatever the audit revealed, whatever difficult conversations lay ahead, Richard Thornton was reclaiming his power, one deliberate step at a time. The first step had been recognizing the problem. The second had been seeking help. And now, as the road curved toward new possibilities, Richard prepared himself for the third step, holding those he loved accountable for their actions, no matter how difficult that might prove to be. In the growing darkness, he found himself remembering something he used to tell struggling students who had made serious mistakes: your past actions don't define you, but your response to their consequences reveals who you truly are. He wondered, which of his children, if any, would rise to that challenge in the difficult days to come? The first rays of dawn filtered through the windows of Thomas Wilson's lakeside cabin, catching the steam rising from Richard's coffee mug as he sat on the screened porch. The gentle lapping of water against the shore provided a soothing backdrop to what promised to be the most challenging day of his retirement years. After a fitful night's sleep, disturbed by both surgical discomfort and emotional turmoil, Richard had risen early to prepare himself for what Janet had described as financial reconnaissance. His phone lay on the table beside him, displaying 27 missed calls and 43 text messages from his children. He had read none of them, choosing instead to maintain the boundary he had established yesterday. Thomas, a retired mathematics professor and widower himself, had offered both the sanctuary of his guest room and the wisdom of shared experience. "They've been calling my phone too," Thomas said, emerging from the cabin with his own coffee. "Quite persistent, your children." Richard sighed. "What did they want?" "To know if you're here, if you're alright, if you've been acting strange lately." Thomas settled into the adjacent chair, his expression neutral but supportive. "I told them you're recovering from surgery and will contact them when you're ready." "Thank you," Richard said, grateful for his friend's understanding. "Did they happen to mention why none of them showed up at the hospital yesterday?" Thomas shook his head. "Lots of concern about your current whereabouts, not much explanation about their absence when you actually needed them." Richard's phone buzzed again, a call from Rebecca. Like the others, he let it go to voicemail. "Janet's team starts the financial audit this morning. She's arranged for a retired colleague of hers to come here to get my signatures on the necessary authorizations. How are you feeling about all this?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle but direct in the way of old friends who have earned the right to ask difficult questions. Richard considered the question carefully, looking out over the misty lake. Betrayed. Foolish. Angry. He paused, searching for the right words. But also resolved. "There's a strange clarity that comes with finally acknowledging what you've been trying not to see." Thomas nodded slowly. "When Susan died, it took me nearly 2 years to admit that my son's sudden interest in my estate planning wasn't actually about helping me." He gestured toward the beautiful but modest cabin. "I ended up selling the family home and buying this place before he could convince me to add his name to the deed. Haven't regretted it for a moment." The revelation that his friend had experienced something similar was both comforting and disturbing. How common is this? Richard wondered aloud. Children taking advantage of aging parents? Common enough that Janet Klein has apparently developed quite a specialty in protecting seniors from financial exploitation, Thomas replied. Sometimes by strangers, sometimes by caregivers, and sometimes, unfortunately, by family. Before Richard could respond, his phone lit up with a text from Janet, "Financial investigator en route to you. Initial bank review complete. We need to talk as soon as authorization forms are signed." The urgency in her message suggested that the preliminary findings were significant. Richard showed the text to Thomas, who frowned. "That doesn't sound promising," Thomas observed. "No," Richard agreed. "It doesn't." The financial investigator arrived an hour later, a meticulous retired banker named Howard Greenberg who had worked with Janet's firm for years on cases involving elder financial abuse. He carried a leather portfolio containing dozens of forms requiring Richard's signature to authorize full access to accounts, investment records, property transactions, and tax filings. "These will allow us to create a complete financial timeline," Howard explained as Richard worked through the stack of paperwork. "We'll be looking for unexplained withdrawals, unusual transfers, new accounts opened in joint names, changes to beneficiary designations, and any property transactions that might not have been fully explained to you. Richard signed form after form, each signature feeling like both a surrender of privacy and a reclamation of control. How long will this process take? The preliminary report should be ready by tomorrow, Howard replied. Miss Klein has expedited this case. She seems quite concerned about your situation. After the investigator left, Richard received a call from Janet herself. He stepped out onto the dock to take it, needing the openness of the lake around him for whatever she was about to share. We've already identified some concerning transactions, Janet said without preamble. I didn't want to wait for the full report to give you a heads up. Richard gripped the phone tighter. Tell me. In the past 5 years, approximately $457,000 has moved out of your accounts through various means: wire transfers, checks with your signature that you may or may not have actually signed, and direct account access. The money has gone to your children in roughly equal amounts, though through different methods. The amount stunned Richard into momentary silence. Nearly $500,000? His retirement savings had been substantial, prudent investments and a good pension had left him comfortable but not wealthy. To lose that much would significantly impact his financial security. How, he finally managed to ask. How did they take so much without me noticing? From what we can tell so far, it was gradual and cleverly disguised, Janet explained. Catherine appears to have used her access to your checking account to set up automatic transfers to an account we haven't identified yet. Martin seems to have convinced you to invest in several business ventures that don't actually exist. And Rebecca has been systematically overcharging you for home repairs and property taxes. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. Richard lowered himself to sit on the edge of the dock, his surgical hip protesting the awkward movement. There's more, Janet continued reluctantly. We found a quitclaim deed for your living quarters in the family home, transferring ownership fully to Rebecca without any life estate provision for you. It was filed 3 months ago. Your signature is on it, but given the pattern we're seeing, I never signed that, Richard stated flatly. I would remember signing away my right to live in my own home. I suspected as much, Janet replied, her voice tight with controlled anger on his behalf. We're bringing in a handwriting expert to examine all the questionable documents. Richard stared out at the lake, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. These weren't impulsive mistakes or one-time lapses in judgment. This was a sustained, coordinated effort by all 3 of his children to systematically strip him of his assets. What happens now? He asked. Now we gather all the evidence, Janet said firmly. By tomorrow afternoon, we should have a comprehensive picture of everything that's been taken and how. Then we can discuss your options, both for recovery of assets and for potential legal consequences. Legal consequences, Richard repeated. You're talking about criminal charges. Richard, what they've done goes beyond taking advantage of your generosity. If they forged your signature on legal documents, that's criminal fraud. If they misrepresented financial information to obtain your money, that's criminal fraud. If they exploited your trust as a vulnerable adult, that could be prosecuted as elder abuse in this state. The criminal implications hadn't fully registered until this moment. Richard had been thinking in terms of family conflict, difficult conversations, and potential estrangement. The possibility that his children might face criminal charges, might actually go to jail, was both horrifying and somehow darkly validating. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Of course, Janet assured him. But Richard, there's something else you should know. Rebecca listed your apartment for rent on 3 different websites. The earliest move-in date advertised as next month. The confirmation of his suspicion about Rebecca's plans for his living space should have hurt more than it did. Instead, Richard felt a strange numbness spreading through him, as if his emotional system had overloaded and shut down. Thank you for telling me, he said, his voice oddly calm. I'll talk to you tomorrow after the full report is ready. He ended the call and continued sitting on the dock, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water's surface, leaving barely a ripple in their wake. How different from the chaos his children had created, the turbulence they had introduced into what should have been the peaceful waters of his retirement years. Thomas approached cautiously, carrying a glass of water and Richard's pain medication. Bad news? Worse than I imagined, Richard admitted, accepting the pills gratefully. They've taken over $450,000 from me, and apparently Rebecca has been planning to evict me from my home. She's already advertising my apartment for rent. Thomas sat down beside him, mindful of Richard's healing hip. I'm so sorry, Richard. No parent should have to face this kind of betrayal. The strangest part, Richard continued, is that I keep trying to understand why. We weren't wealthy, but Margaret and I provided well for them. Good educations, support when they needed it, help with down payments on their first homes. We taught them the value of hard work and integrity. When did money become more important to them than family? Than basic decency? Thomas was quiet for a moment before responding. Sometimes I think it's not really about the money at all. It's about a kind of entitlement that creeps in, the belief that parents owe their children everything, even in adulthood. The money is just the most visible symbol of that entitlement. Richard considered his friend's insight. Margaret would be so disappointed in them. In me too, probably, for not seeing it sooner. Don't do that, Thomas said firmly. Don't take responsibility for their choices. You trusted your children because that's what good parents do. They betrayed that trust because that's what they chose to do. The fault lies entirely with them. Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed with another incoming call, this time from Martin. Something in him shifted, a decision crystallizing. In that moment, he answered the call and put it on speaker so Thomas could hear. Dad, finally. Martin's voice held a practiced concern that now sounded hollow to Richard's ears. We've been worried sick about you. Catherine said you left the hospital in a taxi instead of waiting for her? Hello, Martin, Richard replied, his tone neutral. Yes, after waiting for 4 hours past my discharge time, I took a taxi. To Janet Klein's office, as it happens. There was a slight pause before Martin continued. Janet Klein? Your lawyer? Why would you go there instead of home? I think you know why, Martin, Richard said evenly. Or at least, you will soon. Another pause, longer this time. Dad, what's going on? Catherine said you were talking about some kind of financial audit? Is something wrong? The feigned innocence was almost impressive. Richard wondered how many times in the past his children had used this same technique, acting confused when confronted, making him question his own perceptions, treating his concerns as signs of confusion or paranoia. Yes, something is very wrong, Richard confirmed. Janet's team is currently conducting a complete audit of my finances for the past 5 years. They're finding some very interesting patterns of withdrawals and investments. Perhaps you'd like to explain the 3 business ventures I apparently invested in last year? The ones that don't seem to exist? The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When Martin spoke again, his voice had changed, the concerned son replaced by someone more calculating. Dad, I think you're confused about those investments. Remember, we discussed diversifying your portfolio with some private equity opportunities? They're legitimate businesses, just not public companies. Then you'll have no trouble providing the corporate registration documents, business plans, and financial statements for these legitimate businesses, Richard countered. Janet's team would be very interested in reviewing them. This is ridiculous, Martin said, his voice hardening. I've been helping you manage your finances because you asked me to. Now you're accusing me of what, exactly? Stealing from you? I'm not accusing you of anything yet, Richard replied calmly. I'm simply reviewing my financial situation with professional assistance. If everything is as you say, you have nothing to worry about. Martin's composure cracked further. Did Rebecca put you up to this? Is she trying to get more than her share again? The suggestion that this was about sibling rivalry rather than his children's actions against him was so absurd that Richard almost laughed. No, Martin. This began when all 3 of my children failed to pick me up from the hospital after surgery. It's continuing because I'm discovering that my trust in all of you appears to have been misplaced. Dad, you're making a mistake, Martin warned, his tone now openly hostile. We're your family. These lawyers are just trying to make money off you by creating problems where none exist. That's an interesting perspective, Richard observed. I look forward to discussing it further once the audit is complete. I'll be in touch. He ended the call before Martin could respond, feeling an unexpected sense of empowerment. For years, he had allowed his children to direct their relationship, accepting their limited availability and increasing demands as normal. Now, for the first time, he was setting the terms. Thomas gave him an approving nod. Well handled. He'll be calling his sisters within minutes to coordinate their response. Let them, Richard said, struggling to his feet with Thomas's assistance. They've been coordinating their efforts to take advantage of me for years, apparently. It's only fair they should coordinate their defense. As they walked slowly back to the cabin, Richard found himself remembering moments from his children's early years, Catherine's determined face as she learned to ride a bike, Martin's pride when he built his first model airplane, Rebecca's joy when she mastered a difficult piano piece. Where were those children now? Had they ever really been the people he thought they were, or had he and Margaret simply failed to see the seeds of what they would become? The rest of the day passed in a strange limbo of waiting. Richard's phone continued to light up with calls and messages from his children, each one more urgent than the last. Catherine claimed to be concerned about his medical care. Martin insisted. There were reasonable explanations for everything. Rebecca wanted to know when he was coming home because she had important house decisions to discuss. He responded to none of them, focusing instead on resting his healing body and preparing his mind for the difficult revelations to come. Thomas provided quiet companionship, sharing stories from his own experience and gently encouraging Richard to eat despite his diminished appetite. By evening, the barrage of communication from his children had changed in tone. Concern had given way to frustration, and finally to thinly veiled threats. "Dad, if you don't call me back by tomorrow, I'll have to contact the hospital about a wellness check. This behavior isn't like you. Catherine, these accusations are serious and damaging to our family. If you continue with this witch hunt, you might not like the consequences. Martin, I've spoken to Dr. Henley about your confusion and paranoia. He thinks we should consider a neurological evaluation." Rebecca, the last message was perhaps the most disturbing, the implication that his mental competence might be questioned if he continued to pursue the truth. It was a tactic he had heard about from other seniors at his retirement community, children suggesting their parents were becoming senile when those parents began questioning financial arrangements or asserting independence. "They're getting desperate," Thomas observed as Richard showed him the messages. "This is actually a good sign, it means they know they've been caught." Richard nodded, though the knowledge brought him little comfort. "I never imagined my relationship with my children would come to this. Threats and counterthreats, lawyers and investigations." "What will you do if the audit confirms everything?" Thomas asked. "Will you press charges?" It was the question Richard had been avoiding all day, the ultimate consequence he wasn't sure he could face. These were his children, Margaret's children, regardless of what they had done. The thought of them facing criminal prosecution, perhaps even imprisonment, was almost unbearable. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants justice, wants them to face real consequences for what they've done. But another part of me still loves them," Thomas finished for him. "Of course you do. They're your children. Is it weak to still love someone who has betrayed you so completely?" Richard wondered aloud. Thomas shook his head firmly. "It's not weakness, Richard. It's humanity. The real question isn't whether you still love them, of course you do. The question is whether love requires you to protect them from the consequences of their own actions." It was a profound reframing of the situation, one that resonated deeply with Richard's lifelong educational philosophy. How many times had he told parents that allowing their children to experience the natural consequences of poor choices was an essential part of helping them grow into responsible adults? Yet here he was, contemplating whether to shield his adult children from the very serious consequences of their actions. "I need to see the full report before I decide anything," he said finally. "But whatever I choose, it has to reflect both justice and mercy. I won't let them continue to exploit me, but I also won't seek vengeance for its own sake." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "A wise approach. And whatever you decide, remember you're not alone in this. You have friends who care about you, not your money or your property, but you." As night fell over the lake, Richard prepared for another restless night, knowing that tomorrow would bring the full accounting of his children's betrayal. Yet alongside the dread and sorrow, he felt something else taking root, a determination to reclaim not just his financial security but his very autonomy. For too long, he had defined himself primarily as a father, measuring his success by his children's achievements and happiness. Perhaps it was time to remember that he was more than just Catherine, Martin, and Rebecca's father. He was Richard Thornton, educator, mentor, friend, and a man of principle who deserved better than what his children had chosen to give him. The realization didn't ease the pain of betrayal, but it did provide a foundation for whatever difficult decisions lay ahead. As he drifted toward sleep, Richard found himself thinking not of his children's actions but of the example he wanted to set through his response, an example of dignity, fairness, and the quiet courage to face painful truths without being destroyed by them. Tomorrow would bring clarity, and with it, the responsibility to act with both justice and compassion. It was a burden he had never expected to carry in his retirement years, but one he now felt strangely prepared to bear. Janet Klein arrived at Thomas's lakeside cabin precisely at 10 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio that seemed too slim to contain the destruction of a family's trust. Her normally professional demeanor was tempered by genuine concern as she greeted Richard on the porch. "You look better than I expected," she observed, taking in his improved color and steadier stance. "How's the hip?" "Healing," Richard replied, gesturing toward a table Thomas had set up for their meeting. "The body repairs itself more readily than the heart, it seems." Janet nodded in understanding as they settled into comfortable chairs overlooking the lake. Thomas had tactfully made himself scarce, taking his fishing gear to the far side of the property to give them privacy. Before we get into the details, Janet began, I want you to know that what we've found is significant. This isn't a case of a few questionable transactions or misunderstandings. This appears to be a coordinated, systematic effort by all three of your children to appropriate your assets. Richard had prepared himself for this confirmation, but the clinical assessment still hit hard. Show me, he said simply. Janet opened her portfolio and removed a bound report with color-coded tabs. Our team worked through the night to compile this. The executive summary is on the first page, but I'll walk you through the key findings. For the next hour, Janet methodically outlined the evidence her team had uncovered. The scope of the exploitation was breathtaking in both its breadth and calculation. Catherine, the pediatrician who had taken an oath to, first, do no harm, had established a pattern of small but consistent transfers from Richard's main checking account to a separate account in her name. Over 5 years, these transfers, often disguised as medical expenses or insurance payments, had accumulated to just over $147,000. Martin's approach had been more direct but equally deceptive. He had created elaborate documentation for 3 non-existent business ventures, complete with falsified prospectuses and financial projections. Richard had invested $185,000 in these phantom companies, money that had gone directly into accounts controlled by Martin. Rebecca's methods were perhaps the most personally hurtful. Beyond overcharging for home repairs and property taxes, she had systematically sold off family heirlooms from the main house, antiques, artwork, and jewelry that had belonged to Margaret, replacing them with convincing reproductions that Richard, with his deteriorating eyesight, hadn't noticed during his increasingly restricted visits to the main house. Most disturbing was the quitclaim deed transferring Richard's apartment to Rebecca's sole ownership, dated just 3 months earlier. The handwriting expert had confirmed what Richard already knew, his signature had been forged. The total financial impact is approximately $512,000, Janet concluded, pointing to the summary page. That doesn't include the value of your apartment in the family home, which would add another estimated $175,000 based on current market values. Richard stared at the figures, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. Nearly $700,000 in total, not just money taken, but security stolen, trust violated, family bonds severed. What are my options? He asked, his voice steady. Despite the turmoil inside, Janet turned to a tab marked Remedies and laid out 3 potential courses of action. Option 1 is full criminal prosecution. The evidence we've gathered would support charges of fraud, forgery, elder financial abuse, and theft. All 3 of your children would likely face significant legal consequences, possibly including jail time. Richard winced at the thought, but nodded for her to continue. Option 2 is civil litigation. We would file suit to recover the stolen assets and void the fraudulent property transfer, but without pursuing criminal charges. This would still be public and adversarial, but with financial rather than criminal penalties. And the third option? Richard prompted when Janet hesitated. The third option is what I call guided reconciliation. We confront your children with the evidence, but offer them an opportunity to make amends through a structured repayment plan and family counseling. This would include legal safeguards to protect your remaining assets, but would focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Richard considered each path carefully. Which would you recommend? Janet closed the portfolio before responding. Professionally, I would recommend option 1 or 2. The evidence of deliberate, sustained exploitation is overwhelming, and, in my experience, people capable of this level of deception rarely change without significant consequences. She paused, her expression softening slightly. But personally, I understand the complexity of family relationships. Margaret was my friend, and I know how much she valued family unity, even through difficult times. The mention of Margaret brought a fresh wave of grief. What would she have wanted him to do in this situation? Would she have urged forgiveness and reconciliation at any cost? Or would she have recognized, as he was beginning to, that true reconciliation could only come through accountability? I'd like to meet with them, Richard decided. All 3 of them, together, with you present. I want to see their faces when they're confronted with the evidence. Then I'll decide which path to take. Janet nodded, pulling out her phone. I anticipated you might want that. I've reserved the conference room at my office for this afternoon at 3 p.m. Should I contact them, or would you prefer to do it? Richard reached for his own phone, which had remained silent this morning, a telling change from yesterday's barrage of messages. I'll do it. This needs to come from me. He composed a single text message and sent it to all 3 children, meeting at Janet Klein's office today at 3 p.m. Attendance is non-negotiable if you wish to have any relationship with me going forward. The responses came almost immediately, suggesting they had indeed been coordinating their approach. Catherine, Dad, I have patients scheduled all afternoon. Can we reschedule for tomorrow? Martin, I'm in Cincinnati for work. I can do a video call but can't be there in person. Rebecca, is this really necessary? We should talk as a family, not with lawyers present. Richard showed the responses to Janet, who shook her head in disbelief. Still trying to control the situation. Still avoiding accountability. Richard sent a single reply to all 3 p.m. In person. No exceptions. This is your only opportunity to address what has been discovered before I make my final decisions. There were no further attempts at evasion. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Richard reviewed the evidence again, making notes about specific questions he wanted to ask each child. Janet arranged for her paralegal to be present to document the meeting. Thomas drove Richard to town, offering quiet support and a reminder that whatever happened in that conference room, Richard would not have to face the aftermath alone. At precisely 3 p.m., Richard sat at the head of Janet's conference table, the evidence portfolio open before him. Janet sat to his right, her expression professionally neutral despite her personal investment in the case. The paralegal sat in the corner with a laptop, ready to transcribe. The door opened, and Richard's 3 children filed in, each carrying the demeanor of their respective professions. Catherine entered first, wearing her white doctor's coat as if rushing from patient care, a visible reminder of her important work. Martin followed in a crisp business suit that spoke of corporate authority. Rebecca came last, her counselor's compassionate expression firmly in place. None of them looked directly at Richard as they took their seats. Thank you for coming, Richard began, his principal's voice automatically engaging, clear, authoritative, but not unkind. I've asked Janet to join us because what we're discussing today has significant legal implications. Dad, Catherine interrupted, her tone conciliatory, before we start with all this legal formality, we want you to know how worried we've been. Disappearing after surgery, not answering our calls, it's not like you. Actually, Richard countered calmly, it is very much like me to seek professional advice when I discover a problem that needs addressing. And we have a very serious problem to address today. He opened the portfolio and removed 3 identical copies of the executive summary, sliding one toward each of his children. I'd like you each to take a few minutes to review this document. It outlines the findings of a comprehensive audit of my finances for the past 5 years. The siblings exchanged nervous glances before reluctantly reaching for the reports. As they read, Richard watched their faces, saw the moment when each one realized the extent of what had been discovered. Catherine's professional composure cracked first, her face paling as she flipped through pages detailing her systematic withdrawals. Martin's jaw tightened, his corporate mask slipping to reveal flashes of calculation and concern. Rebecca's eyes darted between the report and her siblings, as if seeking alliance in their shared culpability. This is absurd, Martin was the first to speak, though his voice lacked conviction. These transactions were all approved. Dad asked me to help with his investments. I never approved fictitious business ventures, Richard replied evenly. The handwriting expert has confirmed that my signatures on those investment documents were forged. There must be some mistake, Catherine insisted, though she wouldn't meet Richard's eyes. These medical expenses were legitimate. You asked me to handle your healthcare finances. I never authorized you to transfer over $147,000 to your personal account under the guise of medical expenses, Richard countered. My actual medical costs during this period were covered by Medicare and my supplemental insurance, as you well know. Rebecca tried a different approach. Dad, you've been under so much stress since Mom died. Sometimes you forget things you've agreed to. We've all noticed your memory isn't what it used to be. It was the same tactic she had hinted at in her message, suggesting his mental capacity was failing, that he was confused rather than betrayed. Richard had anticipated this and was prepared. My memory is excellent, Rebecca. For instance, I remember quite clearly that I never signed a quitclaim deed for my apartment 3 months ago. Just as I remember never giving you permission to sell your mother's antique silver collection or her grandmother's opal ring. Rebecca flinched. Visibly at the specific mentions, her attempt at gaslighting collapsing under the weight of detailed evidence. What do you want from us? Martin asked, his tone shifting from denial to negotiation. If there have been misunderstandings about these transactions, we can work something out. Misunderstandings, Richard repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. Is that what we're calling fraud and theft now? Misunderstandings? For the first time, his calm facade cracked slightly, allowing a glimpse of the hurt and anger beneath. I want to understand how my own children, who were raised with every advantage, who were taught the values of honesty and integrity, who have successful careers and comfortable lives, could systematically steal from their father while he grieved for their mother? The blunt question landed like a physical blow. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, though whether from shame or from being caught, Richard couldn't tell. Martin stared at the table, his negotiator's mind visibly searching for leverage that no longer existed. Rebecca looked out the window, unable to face the direct confrontation. "We didn't think of it as stealing," Catherine finally said, her voice small. "We thought of it as early inheritance. An inheritance comes after death," Richard pointed out. "Last I checked, I'm very much alive. What you're describing is theft." "You've always been so generous," Rebecca added, attempting to shift the narrative. "You helped us with down payments, with the kids' tuition. We just thought." "You thought what?" Richard pressed when she trailed off. "That I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't care? That because I loved you, I would simply accept being exploited and deceived?" No one answered. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Janet cleared her throat. "Mr. Thornton has 3 options for how to proceed," she explained, her tone making it clear she was not their ally in this situation. "Full criminal prosecution, civil litigation to recover stolen assets, or a structured repayment plan with appropriate safeguards against future exploitation. The choice depends largely on your willingness to acknowledge what you've done and make meaningful amends." The siblings exchanged alarmed glances at the mention of criminal charges. Martin, ever the strategist, was the first to recover. "Dad, surely it won't come to that. We're family. We can work this out between us, without involving courts or prosecutors." "We could have worked many things out as a family, Martin," Richard replied. "If any of you had picked me up from the hospital when you promised to. If any of you had been honest about your financial difficulties instead of stealing from me. If any of you had honored your mother's memory by treating me with basic decency." The mention of their mother seemed to finally break through their defensive shields. Catherine began to cry in earnest, Martin's carefully maintained facade crumbled, and Rebecca covered her face with her hands. "What happened to you?" Richard asked quietly, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Where are the children your mother and I raised? The ones who understood that character matters more than possessions? The ones who supposedly learned that family means supporting each other, not exploiting each other?" It was the question that had haunted him since the betrayal began to unfold, and the one that seemed to affect his children most deeply. Not the legal consequences, not the financial reckoning, but the fundamental failure of character their actions represented. Catherine wiped her eyes and spoke first. "After Mom died, everything changed. You seemed less present, wrapped up in your grief. And we all had our own pressures. My practice was struggling, the kids' private school tuition kept increasing, and John's business was failing. The first time I transferred money from your account, it was genuinely an emergency. I told myself I'd pay it back. But you didn't," Richard observed. "Instead, you took more. It got easier each time," she admitted, unable to meet his gaze. "And you never seemed to notice. You had so much saved, and we had so many needs." Martin picked up the thread. "The investment scheme started as a real opportunity. I had a legitimate business venture that needed capital. But when it failed, I couldn't bear to tell you I'd lost your money. So I created paperwork showing it was succeeding, and then, it just spiraled from there. And you, Rebecca?" Richard turned to his youngest, the one who had perhaps betrayed him most personally by planning to evict him from his home. "What's your explanation for listing my apartment for rent while I was still living in it?" Rebecca's response was more defensive than her siblings. "You don't need all that space, Dad. You barely leave your apartment anyway. The family home is wasted on you now. I have friends who could use that apartment, who would appreciate it. And the extra rental income would help with the maintenance costs you're always complaining about." Her callous assessment of his life as somehow less deserving of space and dignity than her friends hit Richard harder than he'd expected. Of all his children, Rebecca had been the one he thought most resembled Margaret in her compassion and empathy. To hear her dismiss his right to live in his own home was perhaps the clearest indication of how completely their values had been corrupted. "I see," he said simply, closing the portfolio with a decisive motion. "I think I've heard enough to make my decision." The siblings tensed visibly, exchanging nervous glances as they awaited his judgment. "Janet," Richard turned to his attorney, "please prepare the paperwork for option 2. I want to pursue civil recovery of all stolen assets, void the fraudulent property transfer, and establish legal protections for my remaining finances." "Not criminal charges?" Martin asked quickly, relief evident in his voice. Richard fixed him with a steady gaze. "Not at this time. But that remains my prerogative should any of you fail to comply fully with the civil judgment or attempt any further financial exploitation." "What does this mean for us?" Catherine asked hesitantly. For our relationship as a family? It was the question Richard had been asking himself since the betrayal had come to light. What did remain of their family bonds after such a profound breach of trust? Could anything be salvaged from the wreckage of their relationship? That depends entirely on you, he replied after a thoughtful pause. I won't allow myself to be exploited or deceived any longer. I won't pretend that what you've done hasn't fundamentally changed how I see each of you. But I also won't close the door entirely on the possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship, if you demonstrate genuine remorse and meaningful change. How? Rebecca asked, and for the first time, Richard heard what might have been sincere regret in her voice. How can we fix this? You start by accepting full responsibility for your actions, no more excuses, no more victim blaming, no more suggestions that I'm confused or forgetful. You make complete financial restitution according to the terms Janet will establish. You participate in family counseling if we reach a point where that seems worthwhile. Richard's voice was firm but not vindictive. And most importantly, you do the internal work necessary to become people of integrity again, the kind of people your mother would be proud of. The mention of their mother's potential disappointment seemed to affect all three more deeply than any talk of legal consequences. For a moment, Richard caught a glimpse of the children they had once been, capable of shame, of regret, of aspiration to something better than they had become. We'll do whatever it takes, Catherine said. Quietly, and for the first time since the meeting began, she looked directly at Richard. I don't expect you to forgive us, but I hope someday you might be able to trust us again, even a little. Trust is earned, Richard replied, echoing the lesson he had taught countless students over his decades in education. It requires consistent action over time, especially after it's been broken. Whether any of you are capable of that kind of sustained effort remains to be seen. Janet began gathering her papers, signaling that the formal part of the meeting was concluding. I'll have the civil complaint prepared by tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest each of you consult with your own attorneys regarding the settlement terms. As his children prepared to leave, each one seemingly aged by the confrontation, Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the relationship they had once shared, anger at their betrayal, but also a strange sense of liberation. For too long, he had defined himself primarily through his role as their father, measuring his worth by their approval and affection. Now, forced to stand apart from them, he was rediscovering his own identity, not just as a father, but as a man of principle who deserved respect and consideration. One more thing, he said as they reached the door. All three turned back, expressions wary. Whatever happens legally, whatever becomes of our personal relationship, I want you to know this: what you did was wrong. Not because it hurt me, though it did. Not because it's legally actionable, though it is. But because exploitation of trust violates something fundamental about what it means to be human, to be family. That's the real cost of what you've done. Not the money, but the betrayal of everything your mother and I tried to teach you about living with integrity. It was perhaps the most direct moral statement he had made to his adult children, reminiscent of the principle he had once been: clear about expectations, unwavering in his commitment to character development, but never cruel in his assessments. After they left, Janet placed a supportive hand on Richard's shoulder. That couldn't have been easy. Actually, Richard replied, somewhat surprised by his own calmness, it was easier than I expected. There's a certain clarity that comes with finally saying the truth out loud. What will you do now? She asked. About living arrangements, I mean. You can't go back to Rebecca's house. Richard nodded, having already considered this question. Thomas has offered to let me stay with him while I recover from surgery. After that, I think I might look for a place of my own. Something manageable but dignified. A fresh start. As he left Janet's office, Richard felt lighter despite the emotional intensity of the confrontation. He had faced one of the most painful experiences imaginable, betrayal by those he had trusted most, and had emerged with his dignity and autonomy intact. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be legal proceedings, financial recalibrations, and the ongoing emotional work of redefining his relationship with his children. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Richard felt fully present in his own life, making choices based on his own values rather than others' expectations. Thomas was waiting outside, reading a newspaper on a bench in the courthouse square. He looked up as Richard approached, searching his friend's face for signs of how the meeting had gone. You look different, Thomas observed, folding the newspaper carefully. I feel different, Richard confirmed as they walked slowly toward Thomas's car. Lighter, somehow. As if I've set down a burden I didn't even realize I was carrying. The burden of making excuses for people who don't deserve them, Thomas suggested. I remember that feeling well. As they drove back toward the lake, the late afternoon sun painting the water in shades of gold and copper, Richard found himself thinking not about what he had lost, but about what he might yet create, a life of dignity and purpose, surrounded by people who valued him for himself rather than what they could take from him. It wasn't the retirement he had envisioned, not the family connection he had spent a lifetime building. But it was authentic, and it was his. And after years of putting everyone else's needs before his own, Richard Thornton was finally ready to claim the respect and consideration he had always deserved. 6 months had passed since that decisive confrontation in Janet Klein's conference room. The maple trees surrounding Richard's new cottage were ablaze with autumn colors, their gold and crimson leaves drifting onto the stone pathway that wound through his carefully tended garden. At 73, Richard had discovered an unexpected talent for horticulture, transforming the modest yard of his newly purchased home into a sanctuary of seasonal blooms and thoughtfully arranged sitting areas. The cottage itself, a compact 2-bedroom craftsman on the edge of Millfield's historic district, represented everything the past half-year had taught him about reclaiming his life. It was entirely his, purchased with the proceeds from the civil settlement and designed to accommodate his needs without excess. The main floor layout eliminated unnecessary steps, the bathroom featured unobtrusive safety features, and the kitchen combined accessibility with dignity. Most importantly, every decision about the space had been his alone to make. This morning, as on most mornings since his recovery, Richard sat on his covered porch watching the neighborhood come to life. Mrs. Abernathy from across the street waved as she collected her newspaper. The Henderson children waited at the corner for their school bus, their exuberant energy a daily reminder of life's continuing promise. These small interactions had become the framework of Richard's new community, respectful, genuine, and refreshingly straightforward. The civil case against his children had concluded more quickly than Janet had predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the alternative of criminal prosecution, all three had agreed to a structured settlement. Catherine, Martin, and Rebecca had been required to make full financial restitution, establish independent oversight of Richard's remaining assets, and surrender any claim to the family home, which had been sold with the proceeds properly secured. For Richard's benefit, the legal resolution had been clean and efficient. The emotional aftermath had proven more complex. Richard's phone chimed with a calendar alert, reminding him of today's significance. His first family therapy session was scheduled for 11 a.m., a tentative step toward whatever new relationship might be possible with his children. Dr. Eleanor Winters, a specialist in family reconciliation after financial exploitation, had agreed to facilitate after individual preparatory sessions with each family member. The decision to attempt reconciliation hadn't come easily. For the first 3 months after the confrontation, Richard had maintained strict boundaries, communicating with his children only through attorneys. He had needed that time to process his grief, rebuild his financial security, and establish his independent life. It had been Thomas who first suggested Richard might consider opening the door to a new kind of relationship, not based on unquestioning trust or automatic forgiveness, but on careful accountability and earned respect. Complete estrangement might be easier in some ways, Thomas had observed during one of their regular chess matches. But it also denies the possibility of genuine growth, theirs and yours. As Richard prepared for the session, selecting a light blue shirt that Margaret had always said matched his eyes, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of cautious possibility. The betrayal had shattered his assumptions about family, forcing him to rebuild his understanding of relationships from the foundation up. In that painful reconstruction, he had discovered strengths he hadn't known he possessed: resilience, discernment, and the capacity to honor his own needs without apology. The doorbell rang precisely at 10:30. Janet Klein stood on his porch, elegant as always in a tailored pantsuit, her silver hair swept into a simple updo. Though the legal proceedings had concluded months ago, she had remained a steadfast presence in Richard's life, transitioning from attorney to friend with natural ease. "Ready for this?" she asked as he welcomed her inside. "As ready as I'll ever be," Richard replied, offering coffee from the carafe he'd prepared earlier. "Thank you for agreeing to come along." Janet had volunteered to accompany him to this first session, providing both moral support and legal oversight. Though reconciliation was the goal, protection of Richard's interests remained the priority. "How are you feeling about seeing them?" she asked, accepting the coffee and settling into one of the comfortable living room chairs Richard had selected for their combination of style and ease of use. Richard considered the question carefully. Curious, primarily. These past months of separation have been clarifying in many ways. I'm interested to see who they've become in the face of actual consequences. Janet nodded appreciatively. That's remarkably healthy. Most clients in your position swing between unprocessed anger and premature forgiveness. You've found a more balanced perspective. I've had excellent guidance, Richard acknowledged, thinking not just of Janet but of Thomas, Dr. Winters, and the supportive community he'd built around himself, from his neighbors to the senior advocacy group he'd joined at the community center. They arrived at Dr. Winters' office 15 minutes early, allowing Richard time to settle into the unfamiliar environment. The space was thoughtfully designed, with comfortable seating arranged to facilitate conversation without forcing confrontation. Natural light filtered through large windows overlooking a small courtyard garden. "Your children are in the waiting room," Dr. Winters informed them after welcoming them into her private office for a brief orientation. "I've spoken with each of them extensively to establish ground rules for today's session. They understand that this is a preliminary meeting to determine whether ongoing family therapy is appropriate, not an automatic reset of your relationship." Richard appreciated her clarity. "And they've all completed the requirements we discussed?" Dr. Winters nodded, consulting her notes. "Catherine has completed financial responsibility training and 20 sessions of individual therapy focused on entitlement issues and boundary respect. Martin has fulfilled his community service requirement at the Senior Financial Literacy Program and has maintained consistent attendance in his therapy group. Rebecca has completed both the required therapy and the elder respect training program." It was strange to hear his children described this way, as adults fulfilling rehabilitation requirements rather than as the successful professionals they presented to the world. But there was also something appropriate about it, a recognition that their actions had revealed character deficits that needed addressing before any meaningful relationship could be reconstructed. "Are you ready to see them?" Dr. Winters asked gently. Richard straightened his shoulders, the same posture adjustment he had used before difficult parent conferences during his years as principal. "Yes. Let's proceed." The initial moments were undeniably awkward. Catherine, Martin, and Rebecca entered the therapy room with the hesitant body language of people unsure of their welcome. Gone was the entitled confidence they had displayed in Janet's conference room 6 months earlier. In its place was something more muted, more cautious, and possibly more authentic. "Thank you all for coming," Dr. Winters began once everyone was seated. Richard had chosen a comfortable armchair that allowed him to face all 3 of his children without straining his still occasionally troublesome hip. Janet sat slightly behind him, a position that communicated support without interference. "Before we begin, I want to establish that this is a structured reconciliation process, not an unqualified reunion," Dr. Winters continued. "We're here to determine whether a new kind of relationship is possible, based on different expectations and boundaries than existed previously." Richard studied his children as Dr. Winters outlined the session's format. Catherine looked thinner, the perfectionist gleam in her eyes replaced by something more reflective. Martin had abandoned his corporate polish for a simpler appearance that seemed less calculated. Rebecca appeared the most visibly changed, her counselors practiced empathy replaced by what seemed like genuine vulnerability. "Richard has agreed to listen to each of you make an initial statement," Dr. Winters explained. "These should focus on your understanding of your actions, the changes you've made, and your hopes for this process." Richard will not respond immediately, as this first session is primarily for him to assess whether continued contact is something he wishes to pursue. The structure was exactly what Richard had requested, an opportunity to evaluate his children's current mindset without pressure to offer immediate forgiveness or reconciliation. Dr. Winters turned to Catherine. "Would you like to begin?" The confident physician who had once dismissed her father's concerns as confusion took a deep breath before speaking. "Dad, I've spent these past months trying to understand how I became someone who could betray my own father. The financial responsibility training showed me the practical harm I caused, but it was therapy that forced me to confront the entitled thinking behind my actions." She paused, visibly struggling with emotion. "After Mom died, I started viewing you as a resource rather than a person with your own needs and rights. I told myself I deserved your money because of my important work, my children's needs, my status. The truth is, I stole from you because I believed I was entitled to whatever would make my life easier, regardless of the cost to you." Richard maintained a neutral expression, though inwardly he was surprised by the level of self-awareness in Catherine's statement. This was not the defensive, excuse-laden response he had anticipated. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued. "What I did was wrong on every level. But I am working to become someone who would never again violate another person's trust and dignity the way I violated yours. Whatever relationship might be possible between us going forward, I want you to know that I see you now, not as a resource, but as a person deserving of respect and consideration." Martin spoke next, his corporate strategist's demeanor replaced by a more straightforward approach. 6 months ago, I sat in a lawyer's office trying to calculate how to minimize the consequences of my actions. I wasn't thinking about the harm I'd caused you, I was thinking about protecting myself. That mindset, seeing every situation as something to manipulate for my advantage, is what led me to create fictitious investments with your money in the first place. He leaned forward, hands clasped together. The community service at the Senior Financial Literacy Program has been humbling. I've met dozens of older adults who've been exploited by family members, investment scams, and predatory businesses. Hearing their stories, helping them understand how to protect themselves, it's forced me to confront the real impact of what I did to you. Richard noted the absence of the smooth charisma Martin typically employed, the calculated charm that had made him successful in business but had also enabled his deception. I've been sober for 5 months now, Martin added, surprising Richard with this new information. The drinking was part of how I justified my actions to myself, clouding my judgment, making it easier to ignore the voice telling me what I was doing was wrong. That's not an excuse, just part of the reality I'm now facing clearly. Rebecca's turn came last. Of his 3 children, her betrayal had perhaps cut the deepest, the violation of his home, the place that held his memories. Of Margaret, the sanctuary he had trusted her to preserve. Dad, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, when you transferred the family home to me, I saw it as an acknowledgement that I was Mom's rightful heir, the keeper of her legacy, the one who deserved the physical embodiment of our family history. I convinced myself that my plans for the house, including eventually removing you from it, were what Mom would have wanted, the house full of life, children, activity. She wiped away tears before continuing. The Elder Respect program made me confront the fundamental disrespect in that thinking. I wasn't honoring Mom's legacy by pushing you out of your home, I was betraying everything she valued about family and dignity. I was treating you as an inconvenience rather than as the person who, along with Mom, created everything I claim to value about our family history. Richard maintained his composed exterior, though each statement had affected him more deeply than he had anticipated. These were not the perfunctory apologies he had feared, not the manipulative attempts to re-establish access to his resources. There appeared to be genuine reflection happening, painful reckonings with character flaws that had enabled their betrayal. After all 3 had spoken, Dr. Winters turned to Richard. You don't need to respond fully today. This is an opportunity for you to ask clarifying questions if you wish, or simply to take time to process what you've heard. Richard considered for a moment before speaking. I appreciate the apparent thoughtfulness of your statements. What I'm curious about is whether any of you have considered why it took such extreme consequences, legal action, financial penalties, potential criminal charges, to bring you to these realizations. If I hadn't discovered what was happening, where do you think this path would have led? It was the question that had troubled him throughout the months of separation, not just what they had done, but what it revealed about who they had become, and whether genuine change was possible without the intervention of external consequences. The siblings exchanged uncomfortable glances before Catherine responded. I've asked myself that question repeatedly in therapy. The honest answer is that I don't think I would have stopped on my own. Each withdrawal made the next one easier. Each justification more convincing. It took the shock of being caught, of seeing my actions described in black and white legal language, to break through the narrative I'd created. Martin nodded in agreement. I had every intention of continuing the fictitious investment scheme indefinitely. In my mind, I had reframed it as managing your finances rather than stealing from you. Without intervention, I would have taken everything you had. Rebecca's admission was perhaps the most difficult. I had already scheduled the contractor to begin converting your apartment into a rental unit the week after your surgery. If you hadn't discovered our actions, you would have returned from recovery to find yourself effectively homeless. The brutal honesty of their responses was both disturbing and strangely hopeful. There was no minimizing, no attempt to soften the reality of what they had intended. Perhaps this, more than their prepared statements, suggested the possibility of genuine change. Thank you for your candor, Richard said finally. I have one more question. What do each of you want from this process? What kind of relationship are you hoping might be possible? It was Catherine who answered first, her response measured and thoughtful. I want whatever relationship you're comfortable with, on whatever terms you set. I've forfeited the right to expectations. If all you can offer is occasional supervised contact, that's more than I deserve. If, over time, something more develops, I would welcome that. But the terms are yours to establish, not mine to demand. Martin and Rebecca expressed similar sentiments, each acknowledging that Richard's boundaries would necessarily define whatever connection might be rebuilt. As the session concluded, Dr. Winters outlined potential next steps, individual sessions to continue, possible graduated contact beginning with supervised visits, clear written agreements about boundaries and expectations. Richard will let us know if he wishes to proceed with this process, she explained. There is no obligation to continue if today's session has not convinced him that meaningful change is possible. Outside the office, with Janet beside him providing both physical support and emotional solidarity, Richard considered what he had witnessed. The changes in his children seemed genuine, their insights hard-won through consequence and reflection. But trust, once shattered so completely, could not be restored through a single promising conversation. "What are you thinking?" Janet asked as they drove back toward Richard's cottage. "I'm thinking that people can change when they're forced to confront the reality of their actions," Richard replied slowly. "I'm also thinking that verification matters more than promises." Janet nodded approvingly. "So you'll continue the process?" Cautiously, Richard confirmed. "With clear boundaries and graduated steps. Not because I need them in my life, but because there might be value in discovering whether genuine redemption is possible." It was a decision that reflected his evolution over these past months, from a father desperate to maintain family connections at any cost, to a man secure enough in his own worth to establish conditions for relationship based on mutual respect, rather than exploitation. Back at his cottage, Richard found a package waiting on his porch, a delivery from the senior advocacy group he had joined 3 months earlier. Inside was a bound copy of the educational guide he had helped develop, drawing on his own experience to create resources for other older adults facing family financial exploitation. The title page bore a simple dedication, "For those reclaiming their dignity, one boundary at a time." Seeing his contribution made tangible reminded Richard of how far he had come since that moment in the hospital discharge area, waiting for children who never arrived. What had begun as a crisis of betrayal had evolved into an unexpected journey of self-reclamation and renewed purpose. That evening, as he prepared for his weekly dinner with Thomas and several other friends who had formed a supportive community around him, Richard reflected on the strange gift hidden within his children's betrayal. Had they not exploited him so completely, had he not been forced to confront the painful reality of their character, he might never have discovered his own capacity for courageous self-advocacy. He might have continued in the diminished role they had assigned him, the aging father whose needs were secondary, whose resources existed to serve others, whose very home could be taken when convenient. Instead, he had reclaimed his rightful place as the author of his own life, worthy of respect not because of what he could provide to others, but because of his inherent dignity as a human being. The doorbell rang, announcing Thomas's arrival. Beyond him, Richard could see 2 other cars pulling up, Helen from his gardening club and Marcos from the community center chess group, each bringing a dish for their potluck dinner. "Ready for a wonderful evening?" Thomas asked, carrying a covered dish that smelled tantalizingly of his signature lasagna. "More than ready," Richard replied, welcoming his friend into the home he had created for himself, a home defined not by family obligation, but by chosen connection and authentic respect. As his other friends arrived, bringing food and conversation and the comfortable camaraderie of mutual appreciation, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. The family he had expected to support him in his later years had failed him in the most fundamental ways. But in that failure's aftermath, he had discovered something perhaps more valuable, the capacity to build a life of meaning and dignity entirely on his own terms. Whether his children would ultimately earn a place in that life remained to be seen. Their journey of redemption was theirs to navigate, with whatever sincerity and commitment they could muster. But Richard's well-being no longer depended on their choices or their presence. He had taken that fateful cab ride to Janet's office 6 months ago as a man betrayed by those he trusted most. He hosted this dinner gathering now as a man who had discovered that betrayal, while painful, need not be defining. That boundaries, while sometimes difficult to establish, created the foundation for genuine respect. And that dignity, once reclaimed, became not just a personal victory but a beacon for others navigating similar challenges. As he raised his glass in a toast to the friends who had supported his journey, Richard knew with quiet certainty that the best chapters of his life were not behind him, preserved in memories of family as it once was, but unfolding now in the authentic connections and meaningful contributions that defined his days. To new beginnings, he offered simply, meeting each friend's eyes with genuine appreciation. "And to the courage it takes to create them," Thomas added, completing the toast that had become their informal motto. The path forward would include both challenges and possibilities, tentative steps toward reconciliation with his children, continued advocacy for elder dignity, and the daily work of building a life that honored his own worth. But for perhaps the first time since Margaret's death, Richard faced that path not with resignation but with genuine anticipation, curious to discover what might yet be possible in this unexpected chapter of his story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.